Pro-life talk. Real world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I'm your host, Josh Brom. I'm here with Liz Goddard and Gabi Veers. This is part 2 of a discussion that we're having. And so if you're on the podcast and for some reason decide to click on something that said part 2 before part 1, you should stop now and go to prolifepodcast.net. It would be, this will be helpful, but it'll be more helpful if everything's in chronological order. Mm-hmm. So go to prolifepodcast.net and click for part 1 of whatever I end up titling this thing. Something like, is it wise for pro-lifers to... Yeah, anyway, it'll end somehow. Here's what we're talking about, though. If you're stuck in your car listening to the radio, then you can't do that. So we're talking about a graphic that was posted by a pro-life friend of mine and a colleague, Bryan Kemper. He's, I should have said his website before. His website is standtrue.com. He also works for Priests for Life now. He posted a graphic 3 days after the tragedy in Colorado that basically made the point that 12 people died in a movie theater in the entire country, said this is a massacre, but 12 people die in Planned Parenthood, and we call it a choice, and got people talking about it. He posted it for the sake of, he was trying to get people that are pro-life but not active to get activated, but he was also trying to get pro-choice people to talk about it. And so we've started our discussion by basically saying, I think all of us have some discomfort level with how quickly this picture got posted, although I can definitely sympathize and understand with why this picture is put, and even I get that. And so this is a really hard topic because, once again, I said this last time, but really good people and faithful pro-life people can, I think, disagree on this issue. And we're just talking about, we're not talking about whether it was right or wrong to post this picture. We're asking, is it wise for us to make comparisons like this so quickly after an event? And I want to, one of the points got brought up quickly last time. I just want us to talk about it again real quickly. I think what it sounded like, and I think you had a really important thing to say about this, Gabi, is your concern is that when pro-choice people in general, like obviously some pro-choice people won't, but many pro-choice people will see this picture and will automatically think that we're minimizing the 12 people that died in Colorado. Or if we do this on the anniversary of 9/11, we're minimizing the 3,000 that died on 9/11. And you said you've got a Facebook friend, or is it a friend of a friend?
It's a friend of a friend. In the homeschool speech and debate community, there was someone who used to be in speech and debate. Her name was Petra Anderson, and she was in the theater and was shot, actually, I think like 3 or 4 times.
And so the concern is like, how are people that were there going to respond? Or I mean, I solicited for people on our Facebook page, facebook.com/prolifepodcast, to respond. Like, what do they think? And someone, one of our fans, Michael, said, if someone near and dear to me passed away, and someone took a hold of that situation and said, if you think that's bad, think about the 12,000 people that have been murdered since. I wouldn't be happy at all.
Right.
And so I think that's one of our concerns.
Not only offensive, some people might think that, but I think at the very least, some people might think it's opportunistic,
or like exploitative or something like that. Right. I think that's true. Although I will say, and I said this last time, but I want to be really clear. I know Bryan, and I've talked to him on the phone about this, and I know that he is not at all minimizing the dead in Colorado. He gets such a tragedy. What I'm concerned about, what I'm saying is that I'm concerned about the way it comes across. Right. Not all people are super open-minded or super good at giving people the benefit of the doubt, especially if they're on the opposite side of an issue like this. And so knowing that, is this going to end up being a net gain or net loss in the way that they think about abortion, think about pro-life, the pro-life movement? So here's the question: is 3 days later too soon? This graphic was posted 3 days after the event. Is 3 days later too soon, and why, if it is?
I think that any time that we're talking about a tragedy and making a comparison to it when it's close by, and 3 days I think is too soon, because 3 days later we were still talking about this and the country was still in a sort of shock.
Bryan would say that was the perfect time to talk about it then.
But I would disagree, because that's when people's emotions are connected to it, and that's when you're going to have people who get that feeling of someone near and dear to me just died and you want me to think about your pet issue. Do you have no respect for what I'm going through right now? And it's the same idea when I think anniversaries roll around. When we're talking about, do you talk about comparisons with 9/11? More children are killed every day in abortion than everyone who died on 9/11. That's a big consideration. but I think bringing it up on the anniversary when people are grieving, even people who didn't have people die, our nation is grieving,
Right.
you know, even 11 years later, you know, we're still grieving to some extent. You don't bring up something like that when someone's in a form of grief. And, you know, some people were grieving even if they didn't have somebody in these Colorado theaters.
Gabi.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that when we make comparisons, it shouldn't be done in that manner so soon. We shouldn't be like taking an opportunity to talk about our pet issue just because it's recent in the news. And I think Bryan might say that because people had such a close emotional reaction to it, that was the perfect time to bring it up.
Yeah.
But while you might get a good response, I don't know if that is the way I would want to be treated. Like, you're taking opportunity of my emotional state in order to talk to me about your pet issue.
And I would say that that's, if we're talking about it publicly, I think that something like this would be okay to sit down in, you know, your pro-life group or with pro-life friends or close friends and say, first of all, acknowledge the horror of what this is and respond to it like a normal person with some form of grief or sorrow, and then say, you know, look, how does this help us readjust or take seriously the horror that is abortion? So I think this can be used, but I don't think it's going to have the right effect that we're going for if we're throwing it into the public marketplace.
Especially for pro-choice people. Like, I still believe there is some positive impact that this can have on pro-life people that don't really think that the unborn are persons, or at least believe that way on the inside. And we've done a whole episode. You can go to prolifepodcast.net and click on episode archives, and I'll link to it on the blog post. But we did an episode called something like, "Do pro-lifers really believe the unborn are persons?" And my conclusion is not everybody, not all of them. And I gave some examples that demonstrate that pretty clearly.
Sure.
And so I think this. So I'm not saying it's unhelpful to everybody. I think my position is that it's certainly unhelpful to most pro-choice people that see it. And I've used the word a couple times today, and I want to define it: exploitative. I've said this can come across as exploitative, and I looked up the definition of exploitation, and there's two definitions. There's this kind of neutral term, which is just either it's just to use, like it's to use something, that would be exploitative. But then there's a second, the second definition is a much more negative one, which is selfish utilization, and I think that. I don't think pro-lifers mean to exploit this in the negative way, but I'm concerned. I'm agreeing with you, Gabi, in that I think to pro-choice people it will come across as the negative kind of exploitation, that we're selfishly utilizing any event we can to talk about our pet issue. And I agree, that's at least something we should at least be considering. Does that necessarily mean you definitely shouldn't post it? No, but there's at least one thing that you ought to consider before you make your decision.
Well, I think there's a couple thoughts that need to go into that. And we need to consider intent, and we need to consider perception. And I think everyone's intent is good in putting this out there. And you've talked about Bryan's intent. But the perception is of how other people will perceive this is largely out of our control. If you're putting it out on Facebook as a picture, if you're throwing out a post for people to see. In a one-to-one conversation, you can control someone's perception much better by couching it in the way you talk about it, in the way you talk about of how much of a tragedy the Colorado massacre was, how much of a tragedy 9/11 was. Show that you really care, because if you don't care about those people, nobody cares what you think about unborn people. And if you do that in the right way in a conversation and gently try to use this, you're going to have more effect, and you're going to be able to make people's perceptions of your intent better than if they're just seeing it thrown at them.
I was on a Facebook group that I've referenced before on this show, and a friend of mine was on there for a while with me. We were talking with pro-choice. There were pro-choice people and pro-life people in there, and we basically debated and discussed. And he had kind of gained a little bit of a good reputation. He was thoughtful. He asked good questions. He was good at distancing himself from silly or bad pro-life things, and that helped him gain some credibility with pro-choice people. Like, he wasn't just he wasn't married to every single thing any pro-life person says on Facebook. But then someone asked for everyone to state their views on same-sex marriage. And my friend could have been a little bit more tactful about the way he talked about that. He was really, really straightforward about it. And unfortunately, he completely in one post lost all of his credibility with pro-choice people unfairly. Like, it was
Sure.
unfair of them to treat him like now he's not worth listening to anymore. They absolutely, I believe, unfairly discriminated against him. But that is what happened, and he eventually got booted from the group because after that, all the pro-choice people were just annoyed anytime he said anything, because a lot of people that are pro same-sex marriage, frankly, if they believe if you're not for it, you must hate gay people. I mean, that's sad, but that's true. That's the perception for a lot of people. Because how could you be against same-sex marriage if you don't hate them or want them to be punished or whatever? And so I'm not saying that means like you should never state your beliefs, like you should never go on Facebook and talk about other issues, not abortion. I'm just saying that sometimes it only takes one thing like this to permanently taint the way other people think of you, because not everyone's open-minded and not everyone gives you the benefit of the doubt. And it might not just be you that you're tainting, it's the entire movement that you're connected to.
Right.
Back to it being too soon. Bryan Kemper wrote a blog post, like a lengthy blog post that talked about the idea of using comparisons with abortion and explaining a lot of why he did what he did. And I really appreciated that he did that. He didn't just make a picture and post it.
Right.
He sat down and wrote stuff. And I thought a lot of it was helpful, and I'm going to link to it, obviously, in the description. But he went to respond to whether this is too soon. And this is the part that I was most frankly disappointed with, because I don't feel like he answered the question. This is what Bryan said on whether it's too soon. He said, "I was told that it is just too soon to compare things like these because those people just died 3 days ago. While I am so very saddened by their deaths," and he means that, he does mean that, "I am also saddened that in the 4 days since that attack in Colorado, almost 16,000 innocent human persons have been killed in abortion clinics. Since January 22 of 73, over 55 million innocent human beings have been killed by surgical abortion in America alone. It is not too soon. It is actually long overdue." Now, I love Bryan, and I love that he wrote this blog post, but that paragraph frustrates me a little bit because I don't think he answered the question. I think when he started the paragraph and said, "Is this too soon?" what he meant by too soon then is not what he meant by too soon at the end of the paragraph. It's an equivocation, because obviously, what does it mean for it to be long overdue 3 days after the event? No, what he meant was that we should always make comparisons. And we can debate that, but that does not respond to whether or not this is too soon. It's kind of a rhetorical flourish, but it doesn't tell me anything. But he meant that comparisons are long overdue and that we should always make these comparisons.
Well, and I agree with him that we should make comparisons. I actually think that's helpful because abortion flies under the radar. People don't notice it. People don't think about it. People don't think of those big numbers. Right. You know, I said in the last show, you know, that famous quote that 1 death is a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistic. It's important for people to see the gravity of the abortion issue, and I think it's very important to use comparisons. Right. But we need to know the danger that's attached to them. We need to know that while there's a lot of similarities between the amount of people who died in the Holocaust and the amount of people who have died in abortion, and they're both human beings, that there's a lot of differences and there's a lot of chance for people to become offended. And now we're talking about a rabbit trail instead of focusing on who the unborn are and why they should be protected. And so I think that people need to be very careful when using comparisons, but I think they are a good thing. So I don't want to say that you should never even compare to Colorado or to 9/11. I think those would be good things, but they're be very careful in using them.
Right. And pretty soon I'm gonna want us to talk about some practical, like, well, what does it mean to be careful when doing those? And I've got some thoughts. I know you've got some thoughts. Here's my answer to the question: is 3 days too soon? Is yes, I think it is too soon, and the reason why is because the people who died, they're not even buried yet. Their families haven't buried them yet.
I'm going to challenge you just a little bit.
All right, go ahead.
Why does that matter specifically? What's they're not buried yet, but what makes that significant?
It seems clear to me that if families are still preparing funeral services,
right,
to make sure everyone understands that we do understand that this is a tragedy and that we respect the loss they've suffered, we should wait a little while.
And I would say that that's connected to people having a time to grieve, or a time of emotion. And I think the danger in addressing these topics when people are emotional about them is they're not going to be thinking logically. They're not ready to separate themselves emotionally from the argument because they haven't gone through that grieving process, whether or not they had someone die in those tragedies.
I agree with you. I think it looks more exploitative to pro-choice people if you do it right away than if you wait it. Like, I think obviously there are some pro-choice people that will pick apart anything you do. I understand that.
Sure.
I've got that. I get those emails. Okay, I get that. But for a lot of pro-choice people that I talk to, the people that are willing to talk to pro-life people, I think there are a lot of people that wouldn't be offended by it a month later that were 3 days later. Because it was that soon. You disagree?
Yeah, I don't know if you ever should use events like this, because then it comes to the point where it was so far in the past that it's not necessarily meaningful anymore. And to me, I can understand using some events like the amount of people that died on 9/11. We're not comparing the act of abortion to 9/11, but we're just comparing the numbers so you can understand it. Or like with
which is what was happening in the Colorado thing. He's only comparing numbers and people's attitudes about those numbers. We call these 12 a massacre and these 12 a choice. He's not saying that one was worse than the other. He's just saying it happens. I think
right, but 12's not a significant number. I think the significant thing that Gabi might be getting to.
People whose family member. I mean.
Okay, there's an example. There's an example of how something can be taken out of context and be offensive. What I was more leaning towards, and I think what Gabi was looking at, is the number of people killed on 9/11 is very similar to the number of people killed by abortion every day.
Right.
And so there's some more value, I think, to that comparison. It can be more helpful to understand.
Which, like, where does the 12 come from? Because it's not 12 a day. It's not, like, he doesn't say it's like this is how often it happens. He's just throwing 12 out there.
He's talking about our attitudes about it.
Yeah. And so the only reason he's using it is not to help us understand the numbers. It's not to help us understand abortion. He's only using it to start dialogue. And like we've discussed before, I don't know if that's a healthy way to start dialogue. When I think of people using other tragedies like the Holocaust, you don't just say this human dignity was violated here and abortion violates human dignity, therefore they're the same thing. No, like I would say, okay, there was this doctor who was doing these medical experiments and harming people. Doctor, is it Mengele? Or?
Yeah. He was one of them.
And so I'll say, okay, just because something advances science, does that mean we should do it? Or just because something's legal, does it mean it's right? So I think we should use things to spark that kind of conversation.
It's a more careful comparison. I agree. I think if you're going to make comparisons like this, you've got to be careful because you're going to get, I know pro-choice people that basically think every single time you compare it to anything, you're wrong. How dare you compare to the Holocaust? How dare you compare to 9/11? How dare you compare it to anything? And I reject that. I do think that there are valuable comparisons. Everybody makes comparisons. If analogies
like chicken.
If analogies have to be perfect, then you can no longer use the violinist thing because the violinist isn't a perfect analogy, and we already know that. But the violinist is very helpful for pro-choice people to make him. So I don't but to be careful, like maybe for example, one of those practical tips would be if you're going to compare it to anything, make clear what you know the differences to be.
Right.
Yes. Right. That's what I'm getting at.
If I posted something about the movie theater, which maybe I wouldn't anyway, but if I did, I might say something like, I'm not saying, like, obviously I know that the movie theater, like, it's illegal to kill people in a theater, and abortion is legal right now. And these people, their families were probably more impacted by this than abortion impacts those families. You're noting, and probably most importantly, no, I do not think that post-abortive women have the same intentions or mentality as the gunman who walked into the theater.
There's
this
a
kind
lot
of thing can come across that way. So you note the differences and then you make a very careful, here's exactly what I'm trying to say, and then try to communicate what you're trying to say.
So what is the similarity in that?
To this and what?
Right. What is the comparison being made? Just 12 lives is lost, therefore 12 lives are lost, and that's bad.
The comparison is that the 12 die all the time in Planned Parenthoods. Let's say every day in Planned Parenthoods all across the country, and abortion facilities all across the country, and we call that a choice. We don't call it a massacre.
Right. Okay.
So maybe there's some clarifying language choice, but I'm starting to see, and I think it's true that there's not as much value in using a comparison, or let's say cost-benefit ratio. There's not as much benefit, I think, to be gained by a comparison to the Colorado massacre as there is a cost. And I think there's other examples that we
It's the
can
difference
give
between,
that are less dangerous and more helpful.
I think you made a really. I'm sorry, I totally cut you off, but I'm going to make this point anyway. Then you can
Go
finish.
ahead.
Finish if I didn't finish making it. But I think I agree with your contrast between the 9/11 comparison and this, because again, I had to think to myself, wait a minute, am I a total hypocrite? I say the 9/11 thing every presentation when I talk about statistics. I say there's 3,000 babies dying every single day, and
for a purpose.
about that many died on 9/11. And I also compare it to how many people. I've got a visual way of comparing it to all the people that have died in American wars.
Right.
And pro-lifers have done that for decades. I didn't make that up. But so I said, am I a hypocrite? But no, I agree. There's a difference. I'm trying to help make the statistics real.
Yes.
Right.
Because of the whole thousands of dies. This is a statistic effect. But I'm not making a quality comparison between the terrorist act of 9/11 and abortion. I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other. Same thing with the Holocaust. I don't say one's greater or worse or whatever. But you're making a comparison, like, it's maybe very specific comparisons. Like in this case, a group of human beings were called not human. In this case, a group of human beings are not considered. So you're making careful analogies, narrow analogies, and then people have a better chance of understanding what you're saying.
Purposefully pointing out what's in common. I think I'm willing to say that making comparisons to the Colorado massacre are opportunistic. They're in a way I can see how they are taken to be exploitive, because you are taking advantage in a sense of a tragedy for your own purpose. Granted, our purpose is good and we're trying to use, and our intent is good, but I think that there's much more danger in that than you can make better comparisons that are less emotional, and that people are less likely to be offended because you don't want to offend people. The moment you offend people or they get upset at the way you're talking, you are no longer focusing on the issue that you should be focusing on. You need to be focusing on who the unborn are and why they should be protected, not focusing on whether or not it's okay to kill people in movie theaters.
I want to make a careful distinction here. Our message is offensive. So I don't want to say.
So don't make it
I don't
worse.
want to make a blanket. Yes, that's the point.
Yes.
I don't want to make a blanket say we don't want to offend people. We're going to offend people. I offend people all the time just because I think that women should not have the right to have an abortion.
Sure. Good
It's not
clarification.
making it more offensive. It's basically Greg Kogel's point, Stand to Reason's point is don't make an offensive message more offensive by the way that you talk about it. I think another practical thing, if you're going to do it, like let's say I can't convince you not to post this stuff on Facebook. Fine. I know that's good. I know maybe half my listeners that'll be the case. Consider customizing your Facebook friends into different lists. And this is what I've done. I've got a pro-life list and a pro-choice list. I don't usually customize my posts. I'm fine with pro-choice people, generally speaking, seeing all of the stuff that I post. Because I'm careful about what I post, that everything's thoughtful and whatever. But every once in a while, I don't want to get into a whole debate, or I don't feel like that's going to help pro-choice people as much as pro-life people. So you can customize. If you don't know how, go to Facebook's help. You can do it.
Yes.
But you've got to take that. It takes a little while the first time you do it, especially if you've got 1,500 Facebook friends or whatever I have now, to put them all into categories. But once you do that, I think once it's carefully crafting your message for your audience can be helpful.
I just want to make sure we're making our intent clear. We don't want to put our friends into separate categories of value.
No.
But
Thank you. And some people would respond, well, we shouldn't care how we're perceived. Now, that's kind of a more extreme take.
No.
But I was talking to my brother Tim about this. I think he said something really valuable that I just want to quote him. He said, "Show me a successful social reformer that didn't pay any attention to how they were perceived." A friend of mine named Matt that doesn't agree with everything that pro-life people do. In fact, doesn't agree with many things that pro-life people do. And he and I are not on the same page on everything, but I think he said something valuable. He said, don't make it an either-or thing. Don't we're either going to try to do something that reaches an act of pro-lifers or the Muslim middle. Try to do something that does both, and not to the detriment of either. Loving and compassionate with everybody, and truthful and courageous with everybody. What if we could do things like that? That would be awesome.
That would be better.
That would be better. Win, win,
Yes.
win. As far as timing, I think basically at least waiting a month. If it's going to be a big tragic event, I think there are some things. I'm not sure that we should ever make comparisons to the Colorado thing. I'm not sure it's ever helpful. But
Sure.
there are going to be other things that maybe are more helpful. I think wait at least a month and do it very carefully. And carefully, state here's what you're trying to compare to. Here's what you're not compared to. customize the Facebook post.
And I would say, just kind of add to that, always recognize the humanity and the horror of whatever happened, the humanity of the victims and the horror of the act. And just so that you're making so sure that you're not minimalizing those who were killed or hurt or harmed in whatever you're comparing to.
Okay, I want to ask both sides a question to ponder, because obviously we've not resolved this thing, and we're going to actually record some more bonus content. So if you want to hear some more things, that I've got some common counter arguments that I want us to respond to. Some people on Facebook said some things, including some pro-choice people. I think we ought to respond to what they had to say. But here's the thing. Okay, if you're in the camp that believes that this comparison is inappropriate, so all of us, here's some things to consider. Is it possible that you don't take abortion as seriously as it is? Listen to our episode on do pro-lifers think the unborn are really a person or not? Is something, maybe you do, maybe you don't, and at least ask yourself the question. And consider, is it possible that you care too much about what the world thinks about you? Are you reacting negatively to this because you care too much about the perception, how you're perceived? And I don't always know. I'm a Christian, so I kind of think you got to seek the Lord and try to be wise and
those are great
check your
questions.
intentions.
Great questions for self-examination.
If you're on the other camp, here's my question. This is kind of the reductive ad absurdum thing. Is there any comparison that's inappropriate to you? What if pro-life people all went to the Holocaust Museum, went inside the Holocaust Museum, had signs, and at some point in the middle of the tour put up signs that basically said, you think the Holocaust is bad.
Oh, no.
Think about what, I know you're against this. I'm just saying, what if, this would be the very, very extreme. And I asked Bryan about that, and he immediately noted, well, there's two major problems with that. First, you're on their property. Yeah. He said, never go on their property. And second, he said, I would never say the Holocaust was nothing. You never minimize the other people that died. The Holocaust was not nothing. However, Bryan Kemper has done pro-life protests outside the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So his point is he'll pretty much do it anywhere, and Kim and I would probably part ways on that one. But he is very consistent, and I think he immediately got that you want to be careful not to minimize those dead. So consider both questions. Here's my conclusion. I think this is a wisdom issue. I think if you want to be effective at speaking to people who are different from you, you need to get to know them first. So if you don't have pro-choice friends on Facebook, you probably should. You should probably get to know some pro-choice people and take them out to coffee and get to know how they think and how they act. And if you aren't at this point, probably you're not the best judge of whether or not this will have a positive or a negative impact on pro-choice people. And I'm not saying that Bryan doesn't have pro-choice friends. I don't know whether he does or he doesn't. While I greatly respect his work and I greatly respect him as a person, I think we just disagree on the timing of this post. But I completely agree that we need to activate pro-lifers that don't treat the unborn fully as people that are being, as human beings that are being massacred. That's our show. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.
You've been watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real world answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.